Since 2014, since the release of the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide for D&D, I have spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about encounter building for the 5th edition of D&D and for 5th edition role-playing games now in general. So when the Wizards of the Coast released a new 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, one of the first things that I really wanted to dive into was encounter building and how they did encounter building. Before we start, though, I wanted to talk about where I have come to in my 10-year journey diving into encounter building for 5th edition. And I would say all of that time and energy and thought and conversations that I've had with incredibly smart people working side by side with Scott Fitzgerald Gray and Teo Sabadia on Forge of Foes, working with Kobold Press on Tales of the Valiant, working with James Intercasso on Flea Mortals, that I've had a lot of experience from smart people where we thought about this thoroughly and certainly didn't always agree on how we were going to take whatever approach we were going to take. But the culmination of all of that comes down to what I refer to as the lazy encounter benchmark. The lazy encounter benchmark you can find in a bunch of different books. You can find it in The Lazy DM's Companion, one of the books that I have. You can find it in Forge of Foes, the book about how to build 5e monsters that I wrote with Teo Sabadia and Scott Gray. You can find variants of it in Flea Mortals. Flea Mortals is using it. I helped consult on the encounter building guidelines in Flea Mortals that James Intercasso put together, but you can find a variant of the lazy encounter benchmark there. You can find it in the Tales of the Valiant Game Master's Guide and the Monster Vault and Game Master's Guide. Both have different ways to look at the lazy encounter benchmark available in that. It is also on my website, and it is available as under a Creative Commons license, so you can use it in your own published work if you want in the Lazy GM's resource document, which you can find linked in the show notes. But a quick description of the lazy encounter benchmark is, and some of you may be bored because you've heard me talk about it in forever. The lazy encounter benchmark comes down for two steps. Step one is you design an encounter based on the fiction of the game first. You don't sit there with a budget and decide exactly what kind of monsters you want to have for what sort of difficulty. Can you do that? Absolutely. But that isn't the approach that I take. Instead, what I say is battles come and combat situations occur organically during the game. Let them occur organically during the game. Sometimes it's just two drunken hobgoblins at a table and you and your six level characters walked in and saw the two drunken hobgoblins. You don't have to worry about the difficulty of that. But another time you might have kicked in the door and you see an entire goblin phalanx who's working on their martial techniques for defending themselves against powerful fighters. And you're like, oh man, this is going to, and by the way, they got their two hired Etten guards that are behind them. So you get to decide based on the story and the fiction of the game first, what kind of monsters make sense. Step two is to decide if you think that might be inadvertently deadly. Have I set up a situation where the characters could get wiped out and I didn't mean for that to happen? Now, you probably shouldn't plan an encounter where you do mean to wipe out the characters, but certainly there might be times where you say, I expect this to be a high challenge, so the fact that this isn't meeting the benchmark is okay, because I have other information about the characters and the situation and the scenes to know how that's going to go. We're going to talk about that in a bit. But I have a very simple way to handle this benchmark. An encounter may be deadly if the sum total of monster challenge ratings is greater than 1/4 of the sum total of character levels, or half of the sum total of character levels if the characters are above 4th level. That's the lazy encounter benchmark. The benchmark is a number, a single number, and that number comes from adding all the character levels together. So if you have six level characters, that would be 36. And because they're above 5th level, you divide that number in 2. So now you have 18. So your lazy encounter benchmark for that group is 18. Let's say you have 6 3rd level characters, that's 18 total, but that one you divide by 4 because, I gotta do math because I'm terrible at math. In this case, if you have 3 6th level characters, that's a total of 18, and you divide that by 4, which is actually 4.5, but we're just gonna round it to 4, which means that generally your encounter benchmark for 6 3rd level characters is about 4. There is one other element to the benchmark though, which is a single monster may be deadly if its challenge rating is greater than the average of the character levels, or 1.5 times the average character level if you're above 5th level. So even though you have a benchmark of 4, if you were to drop a single CR4 monster against your characters of 3rd level, that monster might be too much. But a 3rd level, a CR3 monster would be okay. So, just to reiterate, an encounter may be deadly if the sum total of monster challenge ratings is greater than 1/4 of the sum total of character levels, or half the sum total character levels if the characters are above 4th level. A single monster may be deadly if its CR is greater than the average of character levels, or greater than 1.5 times the average of character levels if they're above 4th level. That's the entire benchmark. You don't need a table. And once you kind of wire that into your head, you never need to look at a table again. You can just look at your characters, come up with the benchmark, write it in your notes, then let your characters happen organically. And then on occasion, you might say, this one feels tough. Is it too tough? Did I double the benchmark? Sometimes I've done that, where the number of monsters in the CR of the monsters was twice the deadly benchmark. And you're like, oh, and then you're like, well, is the situation going to allow for that to still be okay? The answer could be yes. So that's the benchmark that I came up with. And there are a few other ways to think about this benchmark. One is that you can pre-calculate it during your prep. So if you know, I'm going to have 5 4th level characters today, since they're 4th level, it's a quarter. So that's going to be a CR 5. That's very easy for me to figure out. So the max, the lazy encounter benchmark is 5. And the max, because they are 4th level, is 4. So you write 5 and then put a 4 next to it. You can see I have an example here where I have 4 and a 3. I just keep that in my notes. That way, even during the game, while I'm doing it, I can quickly do the math and go, ooh, that's going to be too hard or not. That doesn't mean you have to change it. Just because it went over the benchmark, if the scene made sense for that, and if the characters have ways to deal with it, either by running or getting the drop on the monsters ahead of time, it might still be fine. But it's just giving you information about what's going to happen. It does not dictate to you what you should do. It's just information that you get to use. That's a critical component of this benchmark. I have some rules for scaling for particularly powerful parties as well. So if you find particularly a tier 3 and above that your characters are really powerful, they're suited out in magical items, the synergy of the characters is really strong, they have lots of options that they're using that make them powerful, and you find that the deadly benchmark is not a deadly benchmark at all. In fact, it's maybe a medium encounter, and you want to jack it up a little bit so that you actually know what deadly is again, you can add this optional rule. And the optional rule is above 10th level, an encounter may be deadly if the total of all monster challenge ratings is greater than 3/4 of all the character levels, or if the total of monsters challenge ratings is equal to the total character levels of characters of 17th or higher. That one jacks the benchmark up a lot. It means that if you hit 11th level, so you don't want to do it automatically. Again, the gauge is to help you give information to you about whether or not you think a battle might be inadvertently deadly. So you decide if you're going to jack the benchmark up because you're like, yeah, I've run encounters that are well above the benchmark and they're storming right through it. Well, then you can jack the benchmark up so that gives you more information, right? So that's another way. If you want another way to look at this, there's a version of this chart available in the Game Master's Guide to Tales of the Valiant, but it is also available in the Lazy GM's resource document, and I made it available here, which is a little bit easier. If you know what level your characters are and how many characters you have, you can quickly get the benchmark. If I have 5 4th level characters, I have a 5, and it tells you the max CR of 4. As if you just don't want to do the math, you can have this. You can take this, you can print it out, you can put it in your notes, you can do whatever you want. There's a markdown version available in the Lazy GM's resource guide if you want to stick it in your markdown notes. Lots of different ways you can do it. And one thing I did here, this is all just the benchmark. The math is not any different in this than it is in the benchmark in general. We have different tables of Forge of Foes where we tweak them based on different encounter types and stuff like that. But generally we have this. And you'll notice that when we get to 11th, there's a range of like 28 to 41. This is where the benchmark changed and shifted, right? And the lower number is assuming no modification of the benchmark because of their power. The higher one shows that it's higher. But it's giving you a range because once characters hit those levels, the variance of difficulty of encounters is so wide, I wanted to offer a range. And you can see it gets really extreme. When you have 6 characters at level 20, the benchmark is somewhere between 60 and 120. That's a lot of CRs. 120 CRs of monsters. That's like, I don't know how many, 6 pit fiends or something like that. It's a lot of monsters. And then still gives you that, what's the CR benefit of that. So that's important. Big important part of this is treating it as a loose gauge, right? This is not defined math. I am not guaranteeing for you that a battle will be deadly or not. It's a very loose gauge, and many, many things can change whether or not this gauge is accurate or not. That include the fight features significantly more characters than foes. The character's goal in the encounter can be achieved without eliminating all the monsters. The environment favors the characters. The monsters come in waves instead of all at once. Foes are distracted or in disadvantageous positions. The monsters are all surprised. The characters have spells or features well suited. The players engage in excellent tactical behavior. Maybe your players are just really smart and they know how to fight. The characters are well rested and coming in fresh. The characters have an arsenal of magic items. The characters have useful companions. There's lots of different things that can change the benchmark in lots of ways. Likewise, the monsters might be favored if the monsters significantly outnumber the number of characters, or if the characters are surprised by monsters, or if the foes are in an advantageous position, or the terrain favors them. The monsters fight with a strong tactical synergy, or the characters are coming in worn out from previous fights. That's a big one. How well rested the characters is a huge difference in how much power they can bring to a battle. So those are all things that mean, again, the math is loose. Don't hang on to it too tight. This is probably the number one thing that you can understand from this, other than having the benchmark handy to make it easy for you, is recognize that you will not be able to determine exactly an encounter goes. And that is because you are rolling a 20-sided die most of the time to determine what happens. And there's a lot of variance in that die. There's a lot of different ways that this could go. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of different ways that this could go. And you'll never be able, in my opinion, with 5th edition D&D, there is no way to accurately predict how a battle is going to go. The best you can have is a loose gauge. And that takes us to the rules that we find in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide for Dungeons & Dragons. So when I picked up the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, one of the first things I looked for was, how do they handle encounter math? In fact, I had some friends who had it early. I knew some other people. They didn't share anything with me, but I got to learn a little bit about what it looked like. And then as soon as I got a copy, like a couple days later, I looked at it. I was like, oh, what did it do? One thing I will say right up front is the new encounter building guidelines they have in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide are far superior to the encounter guidelines that they had in the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide. And the reason why is there is no weird 2-dial system of a multiplier that changes the overall challenge of a situation and the budget that you have available to it based on how many of these other things. It was basically like having 2 dials that had connectors between them, but you didn't know what the connectors were. So if you turned one dial, all of a sudden the other dial would shift. You turn the other one and it would shift the other way. It was really, really hard to manage and still didn't give you very accurate results. The new encounter guidelines are much better. They're much easier to do. Step 1, you choose a difficulty. How hard or easy do you want the fight to be? Step 2, you figure out how many characters you have. And then based on the party's level, you can figure out per character what the experience budget is. You add up that experience budget together, and that tells you how many monsters you can buy. I will say, I find working with challenge ratings to be far superior to working with experience points. But there's some interesting things that occur when you start dealing with experience points. Because I just think, like, if you have 5 4th level characters and that means you have 1,875 experience points budget. Well, now you have to go figure out, well, what does that mean? How many monsters of what challenge rating can I work with for the 1,875 experience point budget? But a lot of times you have monster lists that are monsters by challenge rating, and they include the experience points listed next to it. The Dungeon Master's Guide did for 2014. I presume the Monster Manual will for 2024 or 2025 in that case. And you'll be able to figure that out. But I think working with challenge rating is easier than working with experience points. So here are 5 main conclusions that I came to after doing a pretty deep study of what they have in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. And one thing I will recommend is my friend Teo Sabadia did a really good video where he showed the examples of the kinds of encounters that you would run between the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide and the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. I will link to that video in the show notes. It's really excellent if you want to dive into that math. I spent more time instead comparing the 2024 guidelines to my own lazy encounter benchmark to see how that played out, because that mattered more to me. I hadn't used the 2014 guide since 2014, so I'm far more interested in that. But if you want to see how that math works out, I think it's really important. 5 conclusions that I came to. Number 1, the 2024 rules for encounter building are far improved from the convoluted and inaccurate rules of the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide. The 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide rules are a pain in the ass to use, and they never helped you really understand the difficulty of battle anyway. 2, the 2024 encounter building rules match up well with the lazy encounter benchmark. They're close enough in most areas that you can use whichever one you prefer. So you're not likely to build an encounter using the lazy encounter benchmark and have it be completely different than the kind of encounter you would build with the D&D 2024 guidelines, except in a couple of circumstances that I'm going to mention. And these are those circumstances. The D&D 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide produces particularly dangerous encounters when pitting a high number of low challenge rating monsters against the characters. I'm going to show you what we can look at with that. And likewise, the D&D 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide overvalues high CR monsters, making it harder to add more monsters to defend your bosses. The way the budgets work mean you have fewer monsters at higher challenge ratings and many more monsters at low challenge ratings because they use experience points, and experience points go up exponentially. They don't go up linearly like challenge rating does. And of course, this is going to come as no surprise. I still prefer the Lazy Encounter benchmark, and I still recommend it because I think it has many advantages over using the table in the Dungeon Master's Guide. A particular one is you can memorize it, right? That if you spend time with the Lazy Encounter benchmark, if you remember to add all the character levels and divide by 4 if they're under 5th level, or divide by 2 if they're over 5th level, and that is your general encounter budget. If you can remember that, then it's way easier to use, and you have that benchmark. And because you know it's a loose benchmark, because this is not going to come up with any more accurate results than any other way, you can keep that in your head, and you never need to look up anything in a table or use a tool or whatever. You just have it in your head and off you go. I already talked about the Lazy benchmark. So when we're comparing the 2024 guidelines to the Lazy Encounter benchmark, I only looked at the hard category because the Lazy Encounter benchmark is to show you when an encounter might be deadly. So I wanted to see when they said something might be deadly. I don't really compare it to easy or medium. And frankly, if you want easier encounters, first of all, you probably don't need to do any math at all. Just use fewer monsters of lower challenge ratings and you're going to be fine. You don't really have to worry too much. I really think having easy and medium columns is not really that important. I think, you want a loose gauge, have the Lazy Encounter benchmark, and it's going to definitely be easier. But really, low CR monsters with fewer numbers than numbers of characters, and you're generally going to be fine. You'll be able to know without having to do any math at all. Oh yeah, this looks like an easy fight, and that's probably going to be an easy fight. So the hard version of the Lazy Encounter benchmark, I'm comparing against the 2024 encounter building guidelines for hard. So now we talk about the experience curve. And I mentioned before that when you're using experience points as your budget, the experience points are going up exponentially. They're not going up linearly. So in other words, this challenge rating of a CR8 monster is double that of a CR4 monster, right? You can take CR4 monster, a CR8 monster is twice as much. However, a CR8 monster's experience point value is 3.5 times that of the CR4 monster. It's 3,900 experience points for a CR8, and it's 1,100 for a CR4, which means that the CR8 is more than double the considered power of the CR4. That alone, it shows you why the benchmark, the encounter benchmarks in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide underweight low CR monsters, i.e. it will allow for many more low CR monsters than it will high CR monsters, and that's because it's an exponential curve. It means that a high CR monster is going to be significantly more expensive in your budget than low CR monsters will. But that can create some really weird encounters where low power monsters are actually, the encounter is more overpowered because they're low CR monsters. But here's an example. I made a table. This table is very similar to the one in Xanathar's guide. And you can find a link to this article. I haven't published it on Sly Flourish yet, but it is on Sly Flourish, and I will link to it in the show notes. This one shows you the actual challenge ratings of the monsters depending on how many monsters per character you face. So if you have one monster per PC, you can see that like a level 3 character can face a CR1, or a level 8 character can face a CR5, right? And that shows you the one per PC. But you can see like when you drop to the 2 monster, it doesn't drop by half. Instead of 4, it's 3. Instead of 5, it's 3, right? 7 is 4. It's more than half, which means if you're facing 2 monsters per PC, those challenge rating of those monsters is going to be proportionally higher than if they're facing fewer. And that goes up even more. If you have one monster for 4 PCs, like a solo monster or something like that, it's 8. But one monster per 2 PCs is 5. 1 per 1 is 4. And 2 per 1 is 2. So you can kind of see this curve where the lower the challenge rating of the monster, the more of them you're going to be able to throw, the more proportionally you're going to be able to throw at them. And the effect of that is, if you throw a high CR monster against the characters, you're not going to have a budget to be able to put other monsters in there to protect that high CR monster, which you often need to have. So the interesting thing about the experience point curve that is a real benefit, though, is if you recall in the Lazy Encounter benchmark, I have to have this single other line, which says a single monster should not be of a challenge rating, or a single monster may be deadly if its challenge rating is higher than the average of character levels, or the average of 1.5 times the character levels. it's kind of clunky to have to add that in there. When you're working with experience points, you don't have to add that in there because exponential experience points already cap out what the maximum CR of a monster is going to be. What's particularly interesting about that is because it caps out the CR, it means that even on hard, with 6 characters of 20th level, you still can't throw a Tarrasque at them. The Tarrasque is still considered higher than deadly. But as we know, 6 20th level characters are going to destroy a Tarrasque. I have fought Tarrasques before. I have had 20th level characters fight Tarrasques before. I have been a player fighting Tarrasques, and I have run Tarrasques against 20th level fighters. Trust me. Even before all the power increase that we see in D&D 2024, they could have killed a Tarrasque. We killed multiple Tarrasques in one fight. That idea is that's not going to be hard. So what it means is I think that it is overvaluing the power of high CR monsters. Walt APR reminds me that, in fact, yes, when I was a character fighting a Tarrasque, my character did so naked because he had his tighty whities on. He had no reason to wear armor because he was getting hit on a 2, regardless of whatever armor he wrote. But it didn't matter. He still beheaded a Tarrasque. So here's some charts. Who wants to look at data and charts? So I have a bunch of charts that show the comparison of the lazy encounter benchmark compared to the kind of monsters that you would face if you're using the hard rules from the D&D 2024 Player's Guide. So this shows 2 monsters per character, right? This is if you have 4 characters, you'd have 8 monsters. What is sort of the benchmark? And we have the lazy encounter benchmark, which is the normal tier, not the high tier. We have a high version of it. That's why you can see these 2 lines are directly up to level 10. They're exactly the same. And then at 10, they start to go off. And then you have the 2 monsters per PC from the Dungeon Master's Guide. And right off the bat, that's the green line here, the high line, right? Right off the bat, you can see that their benchmark for 2 monsters per character is way above the lazy encounter benchmark. If you're using the optional rules, it's actually pretty close. And that's why I say that if you use the lazy encounter benchmark with the optional 3/4 of character levels at 10th to 16th level and equal to character levels, that's why you see these great big jumps right here, 16th to 17th level. There's this great big jump. That's because the multiplier for the lazy encounter benchmark changes. Right. So, but even then, those, I know that this is really hard. Like when you increase it to 1-to-1, it's really hard. But holy cow, they're saying that you can fight, like in this case, CR 13 monsters. You can fight 2 CR 13s per character at 20th level. That's a lot of challenge rating monsters. That's big. The 1 monster per character is almost exactly matches when you use the hard rules. The green line is the challenge ratings that you can use for the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. The orange line is the lazy encounter benchmark with the hard version of the rules. And that one is, close enough that I wouldn't distinguish a difference between those 2. Then the lower line is if you don't account for high-powered characters at the level or more. Then we get to 1 monster per 2 characters, and here is where the lazy encounter benchmark starts to eclipse the other one. And that's because when you have 2 monsters per character, now when you have the extra jump for a level 11 and above from the lazy encounter benchmark, that is significantly higher, and that's because the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide rules discount higher CR monsters. In fact, now it's kind of even Steven. So again, it's interesting because here you see that when it's 2 monsters per character, it's way above the hard benchmark. But here when it's 1 monster per 2 characters, now it's way below that benchmark, right? It's overweighting higher CR monsters. Then we get to 1 monster per 4 characters. So this is kind of like your boss monster scenario, dragons and stuff like that. The lazy encounter, the colors changed. I'm sorry, and I couldn't figure it out. The colors changed, but this green line here is the lazy encounter benchmark considered on high difficulty. And then the other benchmarks are, again, pretty even Steven. That if you looked at actually, I take that back. The lower benchmark is above that of the Dungeon Master's Guide. But what's interesting here is these other 2 lines are the 2024 guidelines and what they show at high, but also I included the maximum CR of a single monster in here. That's why the colors change, because there's a 4th line being added. So that shows you that when you get to 4, the experience point method and the what I call the Paul Hughes method, because Paul Hughes, the designer for the Monstrous Menagerie, came up with the idea of like the one time, when a monster is equal to the character's average level, that is about as big a monster as you want. Or if it's 1.5 times the average level, then that's about as big a monster you want. That's what that single monster cap is. And they follow the single monster cap directly. What this shows you is, from the experience point perspective, the benchmark works really well for a single monster to ensure you're not going to overweight a single monster. Although you still have this weird thing where you can never fight a CR30. But what it doesn't do, and what the other benchmarks do, is tell you, yes, you can have a monster that's at that challenge rating, but they also can have friends. And the friends can defend them. And trust me, when you have like 5 14th level characters, no single monster is going to be able to withstand that. It has to be a very specially designed monster to be able to. A lot of times, if it's a dragon, they need elementals to help shake things up. They need other monsters out there to help them up. The Lazy Encounter benchmark has overhead available for you to add smaller monsters, fire giants that are allied with your red dragon, stuff like that, to make sure that the battle is not so easy. Think about the battles in Baldur's Gate 3. If you played Baldur's Gate 3, if you played the end of Baldur's Gate 3, you'll remember how many monsters are in that final fight. There's no way you could have just one single monster and have it be worthwhile. It needs to be a bunch of monsters. There was like 2 or 3 big fights in Baldur's Gate 3 that had a single monster, but they were really specially tuned monsters that had a lot of BS going on to keep them alive. The Lazy Encounter benchmark, and you can see this high curve here shows you could have up to 80 CRs worth of monsters at level 20 when it's one monster per 4 characters. So you can see that benchmark, and you can see that it gives you a lot of overhead to say you shouldn't have a monster higher than CR 30, but you can have up to 80 CRs. You can add other monsters up to about 80 before it really becomes deadly. And then I did another one that's kind of, just to be completionist about it, which is one monster for 6 characters. And again, you see that the benchmark of a single monster from the Lazy Encounter benchmark matches right along the lines of the experience point budget that the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide has. However, both versions of the Lazy Encounter benchmark scale way higher. This 120 CRs worth here is way higher than the roughly CR 28 that the other benchmark has. But I can tell you, I've met 20th level parties that can handle 120 CRs worth of monsters before it's really difficult. The circumstances can matter. So those are all of the comparisons of the Lazy Encounter benchmark with the encounter building rules for the Dungeon Master's Guide. The reality is, I'm glad we have both. First of all, I am glad that the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide has a set of rules that are easy to use, and I think they do a pretty good job. I think by the time you get to the point where it's becoming that it's undervaluing high CR monsters, it's probably not a big deal. The one risk that the 2024 guide has is that it could potentially steer newer DMs towards running deadly fights at early levels. The example we ran up to was when you have like 4 third level characters, that means you could face 8 lions that are CR1s, and CR1 lions will destroy 8 CR1 lions will destroy 4 level 3 characters. So I think it undervalues the monsters. If you want to be careful, what I would basically say is whenever you have more monsters than the number of characters, be very careful with the benchmark that's inside the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, because it's going to it undervalues their power. And what you could basically do is just, in a circumstance like that, don't run multiple monsters or have the CR value that you would normally have when you use their guidelines. But really the answer is just use the Lazy Encounter benchmark. It's easier to use. It's faster. It's a loose gauge. You can have it in your head and it gives you pretty good results. And I've been using it for years now. Other people have been using it and finding a lot of value. Are there weird anomalies? Yeah, absolutely there are weird anomalies. But you got to remember that this is not fixed hard math. This is a loose gauge to give you a general idea, to give you a little bit of information, a little bit of a warning red light that blinks off going, hey, just letting you know. And it's not on fire, but it's possible there might be smoke in the air. Right? Just something that's helping you get an understanding of the overall battle. So I hope that this discussion was useful. You can find links for all of this stuff down in the show notes. And I wish you luck with your future encounter endeavors in our 5th edition role-playing games. If you enjoyed this show and you want to see more stuff like this, please consider subscribing to the Sly Flourish newsletter. You can find a link down in the show notes. It's absolutely free to sign up. You get a free adventure generator for signing up, and you get a weekly RPG article sent to your inbox that includes links to all of the other work that I do. You can also join me on Patreon. Patrons of Sly Flourish get access to all kinds of tips, tricks, tools, scenarios, and other things to help you run your 5th edition games. You get access to the awesome Lazy DMs community, and you help me put on shows like this. And you can pick up any of my books, including Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, The Lazy DM's Companion, The Lazy DM's Workbook, Forge of Foes, and more at the Sly Flourish bookstore. Thank you all so much. Have a great day and get out there and play an RPG.